not fair.
The decisions on how Scottish universities are funded is for the Scottish...
Yeah, but what are you going to do about it?
I'm trying to explain to you.
The most talked about radio show is here. Call Clegg. 0345 6060 973. Get straight through now. Leading Britain's conversation. This is Call Clegg with Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Only on LBC.
Good morning, this is Nick Clegg with Call Clegg here on LBC, taking your calls for the next half an hour. So do get in touch as ever on 0345 6060 973 or email at nickclegg@lbc.co.uk. And of course you can watch live by going to the website lbc.co.uk. Let's go straight to the first caller, who is Sarah. Sarah in East Ham. Hello, Sarah.
Hello, sir. Hello, Nick.
Hi.
Yes, my question is around this recent furore about Facebook and the murder of Fusilia Rigby.
Yeah.
My question is, since when has the government abrogated responsibility for the security services to Facebook? And why has the government not put its hand up and said it was an abject failure of the MI5 and the MI6 services for not potentially identifying this murderer? The report, the ISC committee report, actually picked up on the failings of MI5 and MI6. The fact that Adebowale had been trained with Al-Shabaab in Kenya, MI5, MI6 knew this. They even approached them to be spies for the government, and obviously this was rejected. They were absolutely at number one on the radar of the government, and yet, knowing that these potential terrorists, were walking in the streets, the government now blames Facebook for the failure to prevent the murder of Fusilia Rigby. What does the government have to say? Does the government not have blood on its hands rather than these murderers in the streets of Woolwich?
So, I actually, funny enough, agree with you. I don't think anyone should be sort of somehow trying to sort of blame an internet service provider. Clearly, more needs to be done. I mean, that's what this independent report by the committee highlighted, that more needs to be done so that the internet service providers have got their own kind of alarm systems, if you like, so that with all the millions of communications that go across their networks, that where something of serious concern happens, that can be sort of flagged up, and that's something which governments and these companies need to work on together, and I'm sure you'd agree with me, we need to encourage that to happen. But you're absolutely right, it's not saying that it's anybody's sort of fault as such. I think what the ISC has said quite rightly is that in looking with the benefit of hindsight, which is always a good thing, at what happened in the run up to this terrible murder on the streets of Woolwich, it doesn't actually pull its punches at all, the ISC report, when it says it feels some procedures overseen by the security services and others need to be tightened up. What they do, however, make a distinction between those procedures which they think need to be improved, which no doubt will now be improved. They don't, however, claim that somehow something could have been done which would have prevented this from happening. That's the sort of judgment they come to. And look, the Intelligence Security Committee, as you know, is a committee of senior folk in Westminster. It's not written by the government, but they set out in a very open way what their comments, their criticism, their observations are. By the way, in a more open way than I can imagine any other country in the democratic world would do. It's a very good thing that we bring these things to light like that. It's in order so that we can learn from the past and improve things for the future. And I think, broadly speaking, that's what the ISC report has done. I just don't think it's a question of sort of trying to apportion exclusive blame on people, particularly amongst the security services, where, of course, all of them work incredibly hard to keep us safe.
Well, actually, Mr. Clegg, I do think that the security forces were absolutely to blame. You're saying about we shouldn't apportion blame and all. It wasn't the responsibility of any one party. No. It was absolutely a failure of the government, of MI5 and MI6, and it's time the government stops.
Well, Sarah, I know. Can I? Sorry to interrupt, Sarah. I know. Of course, I understand. It's an incredibly strong human instinct. When something like that horribly goes wrong, you want almost to sort of blame somebody. But I think what the ISC says, only repeating what they say in their report, they point out a number of weaknesses in the way in which information is circulated, in the way in which information is examined, but they say very clearly that in their judgment, and I can't second guess that, in their judgment, it wasn't preventable by the agencies. That's the point that they're making.
If I can just interject, Mr. Clegg, and good morning. I need to explain
Morning.
to the listeners that yet again you're not in the studio with me. I think you're going around and visiting each Lib Dem voter in person.
Don't sound so churlish, Nick. Just because I'm not with you in
go
person.
around and see them now and shake them by the hand.
I am there in spirit with you as ever, Nick. But
Yes.
no, I'm actually making a very good announcement about how we're going to improve cycling throughout the country at a meeting in Bristol.
Of course, Bristol, the home of cycling. So what I can't understand is how else is one to interpret the fact that until April, the security services were monitoring one of the killers of Lee Rigby.
Mm-hmm.
They stopped just weeks before the tragic murder. How else is one to interpret other than that as a failure?
I think, as I say, with hindsight, I'm sure the security services, if they could go onto your programme, but quite understandably they can't and they don't, would say, could we have done this, could we have done that?
But that's a failure, isn't it?
Well, look, I think you've got to understand the security services on your behalf, on Sarah's behalf, on my behalf, are having to keep an eye on thousands upon thousands of people.
Of course.
These plots mutate all the time.
Sure.
You cannot in a free society keep a sort of 24-hour watch on every single one of these people who might be at risk. So what they have to do, which is an incredibly difficult judgment to make, but it is a judgment, and judgments are always ones that
but they monitor Adabavali until April.
Can I just? It's very important this, because when you have to make a judgment about those who you think pose the greatest risk and require the greatest attention and the most amount of surveillance. Resources and so on, and those which you think are of lower risk. Now, of course, with the benefit of hindsight, we can all say, but these characters were clearly of much greater risk than it was assumed. But I think I don't actually think it's totally fair to say to the security services, look, you need to treat everybody now as if they're all going to be potential murderers.
But you surely say you failed there.
Look, I am not going to say that they have failed when the ISC doesn't say they failed. What the ISC said was that, and I know Sarah doesn't like this, and some people may bridle at this, but what the ISC said was that they felt there were a number of weaknesses in the way in which information was circulated, felt there was weaknesses in the way in which certain sort of data was divvied up, if you like, and they wanted procedures to be strengthened. But they were very clear they didn't think that murder could have been prevented. And all I'm saying to you is, yes, in theory, any single person who appears on the radar screen of the police and the security services who might be a risk, I suppose in theory, if we wanted to live in a society where we have no freedom, we could basically inhibit the freedom. That is not the kind of society we live in.
But they were monitoring him until April, Adabavali. That's the extra. If they'd never monitored him, I think there'd be more credence to your argument. That's like saying your next door neighbour's stealing apples from your home, and you watch and you watch and you watch, and then I'll tell you what, I don't need to start watching, but then 4 weeks later he nicks all your apples. You failed, didn't you?
Well,
you failed, didn't you? If that was your apples, you failed to protect your apples.
What you're pointing out is that if someone is being monitored and the security services judge that person doesn't require to be, it doesn't need to be monitored more or more intensively or more round the clock, that with hindsight, of course, you say, well, hang on a minute, why did you not do that? All I'm saying in mitigation to them, not in any way pulling my punches from the criticisms made of the security services by the ISC, but nonetheless, you just have to point out that when you've got thousands of people who are being monitored, it's quite understandable they have to make judgments sometimes about where they devote what are not infinite resources, and they have to decide that when they make judgments about who poses the greatest risk and who doesn't.
Before we move on, why have you U-turned over some of the anti-terror plans, not least the power to move a suspect to another part of the country?
I haven't U-turned, so this is not a return to control orders by any stretch of the imagination at all.
But it's a geographical location concerning TPIMs.
Yes, it is. So
You've changed your mind. Why?
Well, I'll tell you why. I've listened to the evidence. That's what most reasonable people should do, particularly when the country faces a very new and grave terrorist threat emanating from the violence in Syria and Iraq. So let me, if I can, just 2 seconds explain, because it's not quite as simple as, it's certainly not a U-turn, because it's not,
if you do
it's not
it in 2
returning
seconds, I'd be amazed.
All right, give me a little more time.
Thank you, sir.
So this flows from a report by a very distinguished QC, actually quite a sort of small L liberal type, who said, look, there are some circumstances, not a huge number, there are some circumstances where it may be necessary for the police and the security services, let's say as someone returns returns from Syria and Iraq, to say to that person, look, for a period of time, we don't want you associating, we don't want you hanging out with your close associates and possible accomplices. We want you to move to another part of the country. You can, if you'll move to Nottingham, you can move all the way around, you can move wherever you want in Nottinghamshire, but we just don't want you hanging out with certain individuals for that period of time. Right. Now, why that is very different to control orders is with control orders, basically those kind of that order, if you like, could be slapped on people on a much lower burden of proof than the one we're now introducing. So we're actually raising, if you like, the hurdle which needs to be met by the Home Office before they apply something like that. We're narrowing the terrorism-related offences as they're defined in law, so that it can't be indiscriminately applied to people. And we are religiously sticking to the set of recommendations, 10 of them, which include very sensible, proportionate reforms advocated by David Anderson, this independent reviewer of terrorism. So I think that is a non-knee-jerk, sensible, proportionate way of trying to keep ourselves safe.
And a U-turn.
But also, no, of course it isn't.
It is, because you would. When we talked about this earlier this year, you said that you did not support the idea of forced geographical relocation.
What I said was that I didn't support.
Don't make me play it to you, Deputy Prime Minister.
Don't support. No, I did not support control orders. Control orders were forced. It was an internal exile without any end to it. This is time limited.
But now we can move them to other parts of the country.
Yes, they can, but you can't do things like, for instance, curfews, which were attached to control.
Deputy Prime Minister.
I know, first you wanted me to sort of stuff failure into my mouth in the previous conversation. No, and this is not a U-turn. If it was returning to what we had actually scrapped from the statute book, in other words, if it had returned to the control laws, which let's remember were deeply flawed, constantly struck down by the courts, a number of people absconded from those control orders. That's why we're not returning to them. But what we are doing
yes.
is following those recommendations by David Anderson, which, obviously he's made those public over the last few months, looked at the evidence, considered the threat that is posed to us as a country by what's going on in Syria and Iraq, and we're trying to take sensible, proportionate measures to keep ourselves safe, but also to keep ourselves a free and freedom-loving nation.
Well, we encountered a mild bump in the road earlier this year, Deputy Prime Minister. You don't see any location issue here. That is to say, they should not be able to return to their home area.
I start from a simple principle. If you cannot prosecute someone in court, there are limits to how much you can curtail their freedom. Of course there are. That's the rule of law. It's something we've fought for centuries.
But now we can move them elsewhere in the country.
So it's perfectly consistent. What I said, there are limits to what you can do. No, but hang on. What I said was, everybody's heard it. Thank you for playing it, Nick, because it slightly proves my point, which is that there are limits to what you can do in a law-abiding nation with people who you can't prosecute in court. And that is what this is all about, is where does the limit lie? Now, under control orders, it was limitless. It was literally, there's no limit to the time at all, which you could apply control orders to people, whereas what we're doing under these new provisions is it's time limited, it doesn't have curfew powers, and crucially, the Home Secretary basically needs to show a higher burden of proof, commensurate to the burden of proof you have to show in a court before applying this kind of order. That, I think, is a sensible package of reforms.
We must move on. Where do we go, Deputy Prime Minister?
We go to Virginia in Tower Hamlets. Hello, Virginia.
Hello, Mr. Clegg.
Hello.
Hello, hi there. My question focuses a bit on the support that the current government has offered primary care or not. You may be aware that many boroughs, some especially of the most deprived, such as Tower Hamlets, Hackney, Newham, have taken the greatest financial hits of the past decade in 2014, while continuing to face about twice the levels of demand, the growing demand as compared to national average. At the same time, we've got investments that rightly continue to be made into secondary care, for example, through A&E Winter Scheme money. So my question is, if the government agenda is to keep patients out of hospital and increase care in the community, why is this commitment not reflected financially through regular and recurrent funding? Also, I'd like to know, when will primary care see its funding allocated a bit more fairly, I guess, with a reflection of workloads that are linked to deprivation in the payments that we receive? At the moment, I think the people with the highest risk of admission, which are the deprived, and there's a lot of evidence on the fact they get sicker younger, are receiving proportionally less of primary care funding. We basically all get paid £73 per patient. Only some parts of England see a patient
GP,
5
Virginia?
times a year and others 10 times.
I'm
the managing partner of a GP surgery. Right. And we're finding it really, really hard with the same money that quite wealthy areas are getting to see patients 5 times a year to basically manage a workload 10 times greater, while acknowledging the great financial support that, for example, secondary care will receive when influx in demand is rising, such as, for example, during the winter period. So, yeah, I hope that's not too complex a question.
It is frankly too complex a question, I think, for us to deal with on this programme. But as you know, as well as I do, there is a needs-based weighting in part at least in the funding formula provided to primary care, which should be reflected in the allocations you've received in Tower Hamlets. Of course, I'll look into the specific allocations in primary care for Tower Hamlets, Virginia, and if I can take your details and get back to you. I mean, overall, as you know, we have a dilemma, and the dilemma is that this government has spent more, not less, money on the NHS, £12.7 billion more to be precise. But of course, as you know better than I do, Virginia, the sort of demand is galloping ahead. So even if you increase the budget and do so whilst budgets elsewhere in the public sector are having to be cut back on, it's the risk is we end up as a country sort of running to stand still, because we have, as you know, 1.3 million more people going to A&E departments. We have thousands more people in ambulance than before. We have an ageing population, all the pressures that you'll be familiar with. And so the question is, what do we do now? I mean, I know you make the distinction, understandably, because you work in primary care, between primary care and secondary care. Actually, I think the pressures are across the whole of the NHS system. That's why my party's arrived at the view that we actually need to, going into the next Parliament, need to have £1 billion extra per year on top of the kind of existing trajectory of NHS funding. And then after we've dealt with the deficit in 2017-18, I'd like to see public services, including the NHS, the increases in public service spending linked again to the growth in the economy. But there's as you know, there's a debate about what we do right now. We've added £700 million to deal with the winter pressures this year, and of course, we're as a government looking at making a significant allocation now, even though we might not be in office after next May, to ensure that the NHS knows that it has sufficient resources to deal with winter pressures next year as well. Norman Lamb, my colleague in the Department of Health, has talked about an allocation up to £1.5 billion. The King's Fund, as you may have seen yesterday, have come up with their own figure. So I think it's a totally legitimate point you make, but I would say that in a sense the pressures are on the whole of the NHS because of this steep uptick in kind of demand, A&E, ambulances and so on. And so we need to decide as a country how we fund the NHS now and into the future.
Well, let's get some other voices on the radio. Deputy Prime Minister, as we move on.
Diana in Beverley. Hello, Diana.
Hello. The subject of the NHS and the finance and, how much money and blah, blah. I'm going to be really quick. This bariatric surgery, once they've lost the weight and they've got all that skin hanging, will they then be getting surgery to have this skin removed? And if so, I've lost weight myself on my own. Can I now have a tummy tuck?
I'm not going to comment on whether you need or wish to have a tummy tuck or not. But I think this flows from kind of clinical advice that says, particularly people with type 2 diabetes and with obesity problems, that having on the NHS a procedure to, I think it's, what is it called, either stomach bypass or a...
gastric bypass or gastric band.
Gastric band. Can not only help them, and actually in some cases of people with type 2 diabetes can diminish or actually sort of address the condition, and of course and I think this was an important point that NICE made, this is this independent body that looks at all these things, that it can actually yield big savings in the long run.
It's going to cost a lot, £12 billion, Deputy Prime Minister.
I don't think that's I think that is yet again a bit of Daily Mail hyperbole for you. I think their calculation...
Well, hang on, the Daily Mirror as well. The Daily Mirror and the Daily Mail have the same figure, £12 billion. I think they're onto something here.
Well, the people, the clinicians who looked at it said that even if you triple the number of procedures, that's up to, I think, about 15,000 procedures, I think it would cost 19 million rather than, was it 12 billion? So, I mean, look, I think the people who looked...
You're telling the figures are out by that much, 19
yes,
million.
I think, yes, I am. I'm saying
you're nailing your colours to the figure of 19 million plays 12 billion.
What I'm doing,
they won't
I'm not a doctor, I'm not a clinician, but I'm actually nailing my colours to the people who've looked at this at great length and said this helps people with type 2 diabetes. It won't cost
£6,000 an op.
They say it won't cost 12 billion by any stretch of the imagination, and that there's a sensible kind of medical case to do this. And of course, Diana doesn't want, and I don't want, the precious resources in the NHS frittered away on things that don't make a clinical difference. But I have to say, when the clinicians say to you, look, we've looked at this, it really does, and it actually saves the NHS money in the longer run, I don't think we should turn our nose up at it.
All right, we move on to another caller.
We do indeed. Shabana on the M25. Hello, Shabana.
Hello, good morning, Mr. Clegg.
Good morning.
It's not a question really, but this is something that I'm really feeling very strong about listening to this entire debate on immigration.
Yep.
I think there is a need to distinguish between the immigration and unchecked immigration, specifically from EU, and the immigration of the skilled laborers like me from other countries who come here on their merit, and it's not an easy process because we pay thousands of pounds to the Home Office. One is to get the visa, then to get the ILR, then get the residency if we want, and then the citizenship. So it's not easy. It's a very big professional as well as personal adaptation, a very big change for the family, socially for us. We make this country as our country, and the entire debate on immigration has been such a lopsided debate that it's really becoming to be a very threatening kind of environment for a lot of us here. And this is after, having contributed to the economy, to the country, making this place our home. If we have to continuously listen to the, how immigrants are burdened to the economy and how general public is, perceiving us as a threat, it's not a very, very, good feeling to be in. And I think you must, shape this debate in appropriate manner rather than just going this out of control and making it such a scary experience for all of us.
Let's hear from Mr. Clegg. Shabana. Mr. Clegg.
Shabana, just before I answer, because I very much sort of understand where you're coming from. How long have you been in this country? And you said you came on a skill...
I'm here for the last 10 years. I came from India and I work as a social worker here. And there are many of us, who work as social workers with NHS, with education system. And it is not an exaggeration if I say that if we leave this country, these systems will collapse.
Yes. Well, Shabana, can I just first say a big, big thank you to you and to so many people like you, because you work hard, you bring an incredible work ethic to what you do, and you're quite right. If we were to pull up the drawbridge, like people like Nigel Farage and parts of the Conservative Party suggest, the NHS would collapse overnight. I mean, the number of nurses in our NHS who who are absolutely invaluable to providing first-class care to millions of our fellow citizens is something we of course we have to pay tribute to them, and we are an open and generous-hearted country. I think where the debate, however, needs to be focused is exactly as you suggest, Shabana, is not to sort of somehow condemn anyone who seeks to come to this country as somehow not being entitled to do so. We must welcome people to this country who want to play by the rules, pay their taxes, make an investment, do what you've done, bring your skills to this country. But equally, we must make sure that people feel that the rules are fairly and evenly applied. So that's, for instance, why, as I've said on numerous times on this programme and numerous times within government, I think we should be reinstating as quickly as possible proper border controls so that we count people out just as much as we count them in, so we exactly know who's coming in and out. It's why, for instance, this week I've said, of course we need to look at the welfare, the benefit entitlements that are provided to people from who come from elsewhere in the European Union. They're welcome to come here just as many millions of Brits go elsewhere in the European Union, but the freedom to move around Europe is not... It's not the same as the freedom to claim, and that's why, for instance, and you've alluded to yourself, Shabana, I think where people, as a general rule, should be receiving in-work benefits when they're earning enough to be putting something themselves through their taxes and their national insurance into the pot.
How are we going to stop murderers coming here?
Well,
you'll be aware that believed to be the murder of Alice Gross was Latvian Arnis Zalkans. I'm sure you've had sight of the tragic story. Well, no, the man lived, but he took a beating to within inches of his life.
No.
That playing a ball game with his family.
In South-West London.
Yes, that's right. 4 Poles who have pleaded guilty. They're sentenced in January. They all have criminal records. In fact, one of them was actually wanted in Poland, and 2 of them have criminal records that have considerable violence on them. And yet, it would appear they breezed into Britain.
No, exactly. We did actually talk about this before, and I think that what you've got to do on that one is, first, let's be absolutely clear. We have the power, we have the authority to keep people out of our country if we know that they have a criminal record and that they pose a threat.
Not doing a very good job of it. No,
clearly that does not happen in this case, and that is, I can't imagine the sense of kind of anger and dismay that must elicit in the family of the victim. The solution to that is something we're working on right now, which is we have to get better, and this is the interesting thing, this is where we need more cooperation between European countries rather than less, because we've got to have European countries, we've got the police and the courts and the probation services talking to each other on a kind of semi-automatic basis, so that if someone gets a criminal record...
we had this. I remember you telling me at those debates it was crucial. You told us that terrorism would be worse and we would have terrible problems with foreign criminals if we didn't stay within Europe. One of these guys only came here last year.
Well, I think it is certainly the case. If we didn't have things like the European arrest warrant, we'd have far more terrorists and paedophiles walking around the streets of British cities and not being extradited or put in front of a court in the way that they should. On this issue, what you need to do, and this is what we're working on, Theresa May's taking a lead on this quite rightly with her counterparts across Europe, is to say, look, we need to have, and it's just about exchanging information. It might sound simple, but for some reason it's just proving pretty complex to get this properly sorted, so that when someone gets a criminal conviction in one country, other places know about it as well. That's what we are going to sort, but I totally accept the kind of the frustration that people are expressing that it's not being sorted out more quickly.
All right, I must move to some of the emails. Yep. This one comes in from Joyce in Kent. Lord Renard is causing you problems again. He says you're no longer a major party because of your wipeout in Rochester. How do you feel towards Renard?
Oh, I didn't realise he'd said that. Look, we did very badly in Rochester, as by the way did all the
very badly. Yeah, you got less than 1% of the vote.
Yeah, look,
you lost your deposit.
Yeah, no, we did badly. But how soon we excited? We did very badly. I mean, all the parties
get
lost.
More people on a bus in Bristol and voted for you.
We lost 15% of our vote compared to last time. The Tories lost 14%. The Labour lost over 11%. You know, I'm afraid at the moment, if you are one of the main Westminster parties, people
who causes you more problems, Nigel Farage or Lord Renard?
There is a difficult judgment to make. But look, all I would say to you is look at what happens next.
If you had a tandem down in Bristol, who would you want on the back, Renard or Farage?
I might possibly bicycle it on my own. You can propel tandems on your own. You know. No, look, let's have a look at what happens next year. Look, my view is that we will do far better.
Couldn't do worse, Mr. Clegg. I mean, you really... Even the Greens did better, which leads me neatly into a call taken by one of my LBC...
You are in mischievous mood. Can I address Joyce's...
Because I got some sleep, actually, last night.
Can I address Joyce's... well, I didn't get much. Can I address Joyce's
point
Joyce's point, which is, I think we will do far better next year than many people are predicting, for the simple reason that, you know, UKIP got 2 MPs, Greens have got 1, we got 56, and we will retain the vast majority of those, because actually where we are...
Oh,
where
Mr.
we
Clegg, you will retain the vast majority.
We will retain the vast majority of those MPs. Why? Because...
So what, beginning with a 4, you'll have at least 40 plus?
I'm not going to get into sort of crystal ball gazing on numbers.
It's got to be 40 plus. 50, what did you say, 53?
Why are you suddenly being so numerically precise, numerically imprecise on almost every other show? You are notorious for not... How can I put this? You're not famous for being a numbers man.
No, you're right. Green Party leader Natalie Bennett was in this studio last night with my LBC colleague Duncan Bart. She had this comment for you, Mr. Clegg.
I would say to Mr. Clegg that it's really a great pity, and he's done a great deal of damage to democracy. Many of the young people I speak to, felt profoundly disillusioned when the Lib Dems went back on their promise on tuition fees, and that's something he's going to have to live with the rest of his life. But I think in terms of the comments he's making, he's 180 degrees wrong. I mean, obviously, what we'll see is, there are some good local MPs who are Lib Dems, and I can see their leaflets now. They'll have in very large print their name and a Lib Dem logo as small as you can possibly get it, hidden in the bottom left-hand corner.
Oh dear, Deputy Prime Minister, how do you respond to Natalie Bennett?
Well, complete nonsense. We're incredibly proud of what we've done. Look at the kind of things that are actually touching people's lives right now, straight out of the Liberal Democrat manifesto before the last election, delivered in government. People are going to be 800 quid, if not more, better off because we've raised the point at which you pay income tax. We've got little children in school having healthy meals at lunchtime for the first time for free. We've got 2, 3, 4-year-olds getting 15 hours of free preschool support because the Liberal Democrats. We're days away from being able to announce 2 million new apprentices, something Vince Cable has delivered in government, which is twice the number of apprentices delivered than the previous government. Pensioners listening to this programme have had the biggest cash increase in their state pension because of the triple lock guarantee invented by Steve Webb. Look, at the end of the day, you know what? People like Natalie Bennett, myself, Ed Miliband, David Cameron, you're going to get a lot of yard boo over the next few months. Actually, I really do think when people come to put the cross on the ballot box, they'll say, who's done stuff for me and my family, for pensions, for apprenticeships, for youngsters at school, for the pupil premium in schools? And on that, we are going to be very proud, and we're going to stick our logo loud and proud on our leaflets and say, we did it.
All right, time for one more call, if we could.
Sean in Matfield. Hello, Sean.
Good morning, Nick. I'll tell you how to get elected next election time.
Go on then,
right?
Sean.
Put a manifesto out to reinstate the English Parliament so we have parity with the Scots. And when you address this question, address the pensioner in Sheffield Hallam who's now going to sell his cottage to pay for his personal care, knowing a millionaire in Scotland gets it for free. They've had tax-raising powers before in Scotland, they never used it because Barnick formula subsidised them. Let's have the English Parliament back. Put it in your manifesto, you'll get your seats back.
Well, actually, as on the specific issue of creating yet another talking shop for politicians, I'm afraid I just disagree with you. I just don't actually think that's what the British people want. I do agree with you that we should be handing, just as we're handing a whole bunch of new powers which are being announced this morning, which I think is a really good thing.
This is the Smith Commission. While we've been speaking, Deputy Prime Minister, you just remind the listeners, if you would, new listeners start here. What was the Smith Commission about briefly, if you would?
So you'll remember that Ed Miliband, David Cameron and I made what is called a vow during the referendum campaign where we said, look, vote for Scotland remaining in the UK and Scotland will get an unprecedented menu of new powers for the Scottish people. We've not only this morning, I think you'll see in the report from the Smith Commission, not only delivered on that vow, we've actually over-delivered on it now. Call it vow max, if you like, vow plus, because what you've got in the Smith Commission, which I think is truly remarkable, is the devolution over money, so that Scotland now will be responsible for the majority of the money that it spends, which is a good thing, and it addresses Sean's point, which is this is not asking more of English taxpayers. That's saying that if the Scottish people and the Scottish politicians they elect want to do more things on welfare, for instance, they have got the freedom to raise the money for it themselves, and they will have basically a new welfare system for them to manage themselves in Scotland. They've got to fund it, but they'll be able to take those decisions themselves. That is basically home rule. That's something that Liberals down the ages have argued for a long period of time. We also need, which is Sean's point, we need home rule for Sheffield, for Leeds, for Manchester, Newcastle. We need devolution, decentralisation across the country. But why I think this is a good day and a good news for not only for Scotland, for the United Kingdom as a whole, it shows what can happen when politicians get together and agree across parties to set their differences aside. It means you can deliver the best of both worlds for Scotland. And I think that contrasts quite starkly with the politics of confrontation, which you get from the SNP, which wouldn't deliver any of this at all.
How likely is it the government might include some of the Smith Commission recommendations in the Scotland Bill next year, Deputy Prime Minister?
Oh, I mean, look, I back the Smith Commission and fully back it. I think it is, and we wouldn't have signed
powers
up to
on income tax, all of the above.
Yes, absolutely. We wouldn't have signed up to it, and nor would Labour and the Conservatives and the Greens and the SNP if we hadn't all agreed to it. That is the virtue of this, and this is the point we made during the referendum campaign, which was, look, there are things we can do together, working in a grown-up way across party divisions, which can deliver greater Scottish nationhood and identity and autonomy for Scotland, and that, I think, starkly, is starkly different to the politics of anger and confrontation you get from the SNP, which doesn't actually deliver the things that we're delivering right now, which is home rule for Scotland.
And the SNP, of course, also talked of corporation tax, NI, national insurance contributions as well. Where do you stand on that?
So I think those are not, or at least not all of them, are included in the Smith Commission, but control over pretty well all of income tax, not the allowance and not the base upon which income tax is raised, but the rates and the bands, that will now be a decision for Scottish governments. And I think why it is good for English voters and English taxpayers, it's a very simple deal. It says, OK, Scotland wants to do, quite rightly, a whole bunch of things for itself, different to the rest of the United Kingdom. It is now free to do so, for instance, on welfare, addressing some of the inequalities in some of the communities in Scotland, and it now has the freedom to pay for it itself as well.
News breaking at this time. You listen to LBC 934. While we've been speaking, Deputy Prime Minister, the figures have come out from the ONS, Office of National Statistics. There's been a net flow of 260,000 long-term migrants to the UK in the year ending June. That's up from 182,000 the previous year. What does that say about the Prime Minister's pledge to limit the numbers to the tens of thousands?
Well, look, this was a Conservative commitment they made. I kept explaining to the Conservatives not to make it because, of course, a net target, it doesn't make any sense, because you could have a million people coming into this country and a million Brits leaving, and hey presto, you've met the target. And that's why this was a Conservative Party preoccupation. They made that promise. I said you'll break the promise. Indeed, they have now broken the promise, and they'll have to suffer the embarrassment for having done so. I know a thing or two about making commitments which you can't eventually deliver, and the Conservatives have done it on this occasion. I think it does damage to public confidence in the immigration system by over-delivering and over-promising and under-delivering in this way, and that's why my party and the government as a whole has never espoused this net migration target. We need to deal with immigration in an intelligent way, in a way that we discussed with Shabana earlier, but not by raising false hopes that you can meet a net target over which, in many respects, the government of the day doesn't have complete control.
Your points are fairly made there, but of course the coalition government's policy now concerning immigration or control is a shambles, isn't it?
No, it's not. As I say,
it's gone up.
No, well,
182 plays 260.
Yeah. Well, look, I need to look into the reasons why. Maybe fewer Brits are leaving. I need to understand.
Put it down to that, do we? There's not the possibility that more Polish criminals are arriving.
No. Look, it's a net target. That's the whole point. So it's the number of people coming minus the people who've left. So clearly, this final figure is partly influenced by the number of people who've left, which is part of the reason why my party and the government as a whole has never endorsed the Conservative Party net migration target. Let's look sensibly at how we can reform benefits, put in proper border controls, and give the public proper confidence that we have a well-managed immigration system. That's what I want to do.
Two real quick ones from me. Have you ever had to take your boys to A&E instead of waiting for your GP, as was the case with Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt?
I have taken my children to a sort of minor injuries unit on the weekend. I mean, look, I think on weekends in particular, I wouldn't begrudge any parent from doing obviously what they think is right for their child. And I think one of the solutions to this is to make sure that we work with GP surgeries to make sure that they're more readily available in those hours after work and in the weekends when often, parents feel at a bit of a loss about what they're going to do with a sick child.
Lastly, you're a sports fan. A word on the tragic news that came out of Australia earlier this morning, Deputy Prime Minister. He was just weeks shy of his 26th birthday. Philip Hughes succumbing to those injuries from a bouncing delivery earlier in the week. He was an Aussie Test batsman, of course.
I mean, quite horrific. Obviously, a lovely bloke, fantastic cricketer. It's just one of these freak things. He had a helmet on, but the ball obviously hit him a very vulnerable part of his sort of upper neck where it was exposed and not protected by the helmet. My heart just goes out, and all my sympathy, condolences to him, his fans, in his family and friends.
Good luck with the announcement you're making later today, the provision of facilities for cycling, not just, of course, in the West Country, but across the whole of the country. Deputy Prime Minister, I look forward to welcoming you back to the studios here. Thank you for your time on Call Clegg. Thanks, Mr. Clegg. That's Nick Clegg here on LBC, where news is next.
The Deputy Prime Minister has told LBC the Conservatives have broken their promise to reduce net migration and will now